Hey friends, I'm just gonna hop on for a few minutes and talk about how to plan a riot. Right now, we are in the midst of a very turbulent time in our country, and tonight there are riots and uprisings happening all over the country. And I'm seeing lots of people very, very frustrated, and duly so. Buildings are being burned, people are losing employment and property. Those kind of things rightfully upset us. But I also wanted to give context to why this happens, how it happens, and what the dynamics are. One of the questions that I've heard a lot today or yesterday, I should say, would be, why are they at Target? Why is Target being burned down? They should be at the police station. In my years of being a part of nonviolent protest, one thing I know is that the police really do choose where protests happen. Yes, you have the constitutional right to assemble and gather and protest wherever you want, pretty much. But police are going to be involved and they're going to direct traffic and they're going to choose the places that they protect and the places that they leave to fend for themselves. And so sometimes you'll see a store or a neighborhood get torn down, especially if it's our neighborhoods, people of color neighborhoods get torn down because those aren't the neighborhoods that the police decide to protect. In Chicago, we've been marching through the south side of Chicago, and they'll let us take our peaceful protests anywhere we want until we get to certain parts of Hyde Park where white, affluent homes are. And all of a sudden, the police who were escorting us that entire time form a barricade. And they're no longer our escorts. They're our blockage to continuing the peaceful protest that we've been doing this entire time through every the neighborhoods in the city. And so, what I'm trying to do is give some context to that. Even, no matter what your plan was for your marching route or your protest route, the police real time may decide, oh no, we want you to go down this street, not that street. They'll real time direct the entire crowd of people wherever they want, and they will make a hard line of resistance on where they don't want you to go. And so you may have a plan of where you want to go and where you want to be. And this kind of plays into what's happening at CNN right now. There was a line, there was a plan for where they would peacefully protest and where they would start and where they would go. And from what I'm hearing from friends on the ground, that plan was interrupted by officers and that they blocked them from their original route, which is how they ended up in front of the CNN building. Let's look at the social context of this. Police officers are overwhelmingly conservative in their politics, and CNN is often considered an enemy of conservatives. So if a peaceful protest is supposed to be happening in a certain direction and it gets redirected to someplace else that is not favorable in your eyes, and I've already mentioned how police let certain things happen where they don't care, or where they want things to pop off, they just might let it pop off on the non-conservative news channel. And so I also want to talk about my experience in Chicago the last time Donald Trump was here when we kicked him out. That protest drew people from every walk of Chicago life, every ethnicity, every age group, very large numbers of people, completely peaceful protest. People had signs, people were angry, but it was a Chicago love fest. But we also had huge numbers of Chicago police officers. And what the media will show you, and I wish I still had the screenshots. I'm a photographer, and I would use the app that would invite photographers and video people to collect footage of things happening around Chicago. And I had one of the notifications that because there was a protest, because it was Donald Trump, they said, get pictures of people fighting. They asked to get pictures of people confronting officers. They didn't care about people singing. They didn't care about people dancing. They wanted pictures of conflict, and that was the only thing that they were going to pay me for. And so when you watch a news program and the only pictures you see are the things that got burned up, That's because that's what they paid for. That's not just them unbiasedly covering the news. And so when the Donald Trump protests were happening in Chicago, and we were out there again, banners, love, people singing and dancing. Entire squads of Chicago police officers would come, linked armed in arm, and then they would announce, okay, you need to move out of this street. And we're talking about hundreds of people in an intersection or something like that that was previously fine to be in. You all need to get out of the street right now. And so they link arms and they start pushing through the crowd. Now, hundreds of people do not move quickly, especially in that kind of moment where it was okay for them to stand is suddenly not okay. So now you're getting pushed, and then you're being pushed from behind, people are getting stepped on, and the police are using that to say you're resisting or you're not compliant. And so what was a peaceful protest suddenly becomes disorderly. And with my own eyes, I saw what went from people dancing and having a good time to watching someone get hit in the head with the baton because the police decided that suddenly he needed to move. Now, again, yes, when things get destructed, it is horrible. But you have to remember why we are out there. You have to remember what is going on that's caused people to go to these different places. And the issue that we're addressing is police brutality. I did a little quick search online, and I found an article that talked about the science of police handling protests. And one of the things that they know for sure is that people typically show up to a protest for what they're there for. But if they encounter heavy-handed policing, they lose focus of the protest, and now they're angry at the police. This is kind of the same thing that happens in a police stop or something like that. How the police officer treats you gets turned into how you feel about the police. And so if you're treated rudely by the police officer, you're going to not have very kind feelings. What they found is that when police officers show up and they don't have their guns and their weapons showing, when they show up and they offer themselves as assistance to protect people's rights to protest and to make sure that traffic stays out of the way and to be a support for the protest, violence doesn't happen. It doesn't get out of control. But when police use the heavy-handed methods, when they pull out the tear gas, when they pull out the rubber bullets, when they start hosing people down, that's when things happen. And then there's another piece of this I really want to name. I have seen with my own eyes at protests, because there's too many people who have never been to a protest who have lots of things to say. I've seen with my own eyes at protests people that are very obviously not a part of the protest, people that are very obviously anarchists, people that are very obviously agents and provocateurs, people who show up again, anyone in the crowd was like, who is that? Where did they come from? Nobody knows them. And they're the ones that are trying to get folks to go over and bang on a window or bang on a car. And most organizers of protests have people, have radios, have phones, have systems set up so they can intervene with that, because we know what happens. There are opportunists who will show up at anything and try and disrupt what's happening. And so what I've seen is that at an event, random folks join a protest. They don't know what's going on. They just want to walk with the crowd. Drunk folk join a protest. They don't know what's going on. They're just there for a party. All kinds of things happen. And sometimes it does get out of control. Every protest I've been a part of, when the police need to show up, when an ambulance needs to get through, the people who are there have no problem making room for that. I've never seen an ambulance be blocked. I've never seen people resist the police unless they are making a targeted arrest. And by targeted, I mean they'll pick out whoever they feel like is a leader or whoever they feel like will get a lot of attention. And they'll very aggressively, very roughly try to subdue them and arrest them. In those cases, I've seen the crowd try to get the person away from the police, but they're still not trying to fight the police. They're trying to save the person who's probably bleeding at this point because they've been beaten with the baton, they've been hit, they've been thrown onto the concrete. But again, it's not, okay, now everybody, let's fight the police. That's not what happens. So when things do get rough, again, if the powers that be want a nonviolent protest, then they need to show up and support people. They need to make sure that people feel protected in their protesting. If you don't want that, then you show up in your riot gear, you bring your SWAT teams, you bring your tanks out, you bring your heavy artillery, and you start a fight. I'll share another story from Ferguson, Missouri. I went there with a college group a couple months after Mike Brown was killed. And from what I watched in the 24-hour news coverage, I just knew I was going to be showing up to a war-torn area where all the buildings were burned down. And I knew that because I saw it on the news, right? When we were driving there, I kept preparing myself to see all this devastation. I was preparing myself to see all this hopelessness. And then we're driving through this nice little suburban neighborhood. And I saw, oh, wait, that's the gas station that was on the news. But it's right next to a grocery store, and it's right next to a playground, and there's a road, and people are just walking, and all the people in the neighborhood are saying hi. And I was like, wait, we're here? This isn't the war-torn, horrendous place that I saw on the news from multiple channels, including channels like CNN. No, it was a suburban, quiet neighborhood where people were trying to live their lives, where people were upset about somebody who's lived in their neighborhood who was unjustly killed. And what we got on the media was a profit-making enterprise that showed us the 4 or 5 buildings that got burned down. And when you talked to the actual residents, they could tell you the buildings that were part of the neighborhood, the buildings where people had relationships in the neighborhood, untouched. Right next door, where you had commercial enterprises and people who had been notoriously bad in the neighborhood, those were burnt to a crisp. It was very selective. It was very intentional about what happened, and don't know who did it, but we do know that only certain neighborhoods were burned. And I think a prime example of this is the store where allegedly Michael Brown was robbing. That store is untouched, and the owner is still in that store today. If he was really a problem, if Mike Brown was really a problem in that store, if that store had a bad relationship with the neighborhood, it would have been burned to the ground like the establishment that was right next door to it. But it wasn't, because even as people are angry and even as people are responding to the horrible things that happen, it's not just completely every man for themselves. And so what I'm hoping to do in this resource, in this video that's way longer than I really wanted to do, is to remind you that what you see on the news is not the whole story. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm not somebody who says don't trust the news and you can't. But I need you to remember that it is a money-making enterprise, that we don't have unbiased and neutral journalism at this point in any mainstream fashion. There are a few places like Unicorn Riot on Twitter where you are getting intentionally on the ground reporting. But anybody who's got a news network is selling ads to major corporations, they have a bottom line, and it is not simply telling the truth. It is making sure that you are glued to their channel.